On August 8, 1944, a British Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft from RAF Squadron 540 flew over Bavaria at 700 kilometers per hour, convinced that nothing in the German sky could reach it. He was right. Until that day. Something rose to intercept it. It had no propeller. It did not make the usual roaring sound of a piston engine. It emitted a strange, almost ghostly whistle and moved with a speed that the British pilot had never seen. Lieutenant Joachim Weber aligned the shot. The Mosquito fell. It was the first jet aircraft to shoot down an adversary in combat. The aerial world had just changed. But that victory took too long to arrive. It came when Germany was already losing, when the factories were burning under Allied bombings, when fuels were scarce, when the Reich's most brilliant engineers worked underground in bunkers lit by spotlights. What you will see in this script are 20 weapons that, if they had arrived 6 months earlier, a year earlier, perhaps would have rewritten the end of the Second World War. Rockets that could reach space. Submarines that sailed faster submerged than on the surface. Bombs guided with millimetric precision, propellerless planes that traveled at speeds that made any Allied fighter laughable. Torpedoes that chased ships by the noise of their propellers. Anti-aircraft missiles capable of reaching 20,000 meters in altitude. They were here, they worked, and they arrived too late. These are the 20 secret weapons that almost saved Nazi Germany. In the spring of 1943, General Adolf Galland flew the prototype of the Me 262 and returned to the ground with a phrase he would repeat for the rest of his life. It was as if an angel were pushing me. At 870 kilometers per hour, with 2 Junkers Jumo 4B turbines under the wings, he had experienced something that no Allied pilot had or would have until months later. The Me 262 was born in 1938 as a design project of the RLM, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, German aviation. Hans Ants worked on the cell. Hans Mauch and Helmut Schlepp took care of the engines. The approach was elegant, housing 2 turbines in gondolas under the wings of a monoplane with slightly swept wings. The project designation was P1065 at the Messerschmitt Design Office in Augsburg. Detailed plans existed since June 7, 1939. The problem was the engines. BMW promised to deliver its P3302 at the end of that same year. They did not arrive. The prototype of the BMW engine 109.3 did not run until August 1940, and then it produced barely 150 kilos of static thrust compared to the 600 promised. By mid-1943, the 3 still did not reach the necessary power. The solution came from the rival engine, the Junkers Jumo 4, which first flew hanging under a Messerschmitt Bf 110 on March 15, 1942. The flight of the first Me 262 fully jet-powered occurred on July 18, 1942, piloted by Fritz Wendel. 4 months later, manufacturing orders for 60 aircraft. In June 1943, general production order. The machinery was being put in motion. Then Hitler intervened. The Führer decided that the Me 262 would be a bomber, not a fighter. That it would carry 500 kilos of bombs over England to continue his harassment campaigns, that the Reich needed to attack, not defend. This decision suspended for months the production of the Schwalbe Swallow fighter variant in favor of the Sturmvogel Storm Petrel, the bomber. The Me 262 did not enter service until October 3, 1944, more than 2 years after its first full jet flight. The Messerschmitt plant in Regensburg was bombed on August 17, 1943. Development programs moved to Oberammergau, more delays. About 1,430 Me 262 were produced in 7 main variants. Probably no more than a third saw combat. In the 7 months they operated actively, they are credited with more than 735 victories. The highest scoring pilot was Oberleutnant Kurt Welter, with more than 20 victories, mainly nocturnal Mosquitoes. 27 German pilots became jet aces. Galland himself formed the ad hoc unit Jagdverband 44 with decorated veterans, which operated in increasingly chaotic conditions during the spring of 1945. But the arithmetic was brutal. In 1944, the Allies produced more than 100,000 aircraft per year. Germany, with its factories under bombing, barely manufactured its own. The Me-262 was master of the air in each individual encounter. Multiplied by 100 squadrons equipped and trained since 1943, it would have turned European airspace into a territory inaccessible to Allied bombers. There were not 100 squadrons. There was a shortage of J-2 fuel, of pilots trained in the new technology, of runways that could withstand the weight of assisted takeoffs. The Allies quickly learned that the Me-262 were vulnerable at the moment of takeoff and landing when their speed was reduced. They stationed fighters over German runways. Lieutenant Alfred Schreiber, the first pilot to damage an enemy aircraft with a jet on July 26, 1944, was killed on November 26 of that same year when his wheels brushed the edge of a ditch during landing at Lechfeld. He was 21 years old. The question that historians have not stopped asking themselves since then is how much the war would have changed if the Me-262 had entered massive service in mid-1944. Before the Me-262, the He-178 existed. It was smaller, more fragile, and older by a year and a half. On August 27, 1939, 4 days before Germany invaded Poland, the He-178 took off in Rostock-Marienje and became the first jet-propelled aircraft to fly successfully in human history. Ernst Heinkel had achieved something extraordinary without almost anyone noticing. His engine had been running since 1937. The HES-1, the first prototype, ran on hydrogen because it was the only thing that produced a reaction stable enough not to destroy itself on the test bench. It gave about 250 kilos of static thrust in September of that year. Little, but real and functional, 6 months before Frank Whittle finished building his in England. Joachim Pabst von Ohain and his assistant Max Hahn had been recruited directly from the University of Göttingen, where they had done the pioneering work, with Heinkel's private funds. No one else was financing them. No one else believed that it had a practical future in the short term. By March 1938, they had the HES-3, powered by ordinary petroleum and with 500 kilos of thrust. Heinkel installed it in the fuselage of the He-178, a mid-wing monoplane with the cockpit well forward of the front air intake, the engine and its exhaust pipe occupying almost all the remaining fuselage. The plane jumped down the runway 3 days before the official flight on August 24. The full flight was on the 27th. Heinkel immediately sent word to the Air Ministry the RLM official interest was practically zero. The He-178 was demonstrated before senior officials of the RLM on November 1, 1939. Ernst Udet and Erhard Milch attended. Milch left before the demonstration ended, apparently because he had other commitments. Udet at least stayed, but the collective enthusiasm was so scarce that no one commissioned a development contract. The aircraft was transferred to the Berlin Air Museum, where it was destroyed in an Allied bombing in 1943. Heinkel did not give up. He had learned something from the He-178. Mounting the engine inside the fuselage created air intake problems difficult to solve. The solution was to separate it. He designed a twin-engine jet fighter, the He-280, with 2 turbines in gondolas under low-mounted wings, while von Ohain developed the HES-8 in Rostock-Marienje with 500 kilos of thrust each motor. Max Müller had arrived from Junkers to work on the HES-30, which became the 109-6. 2 teams, same company, different engines, internal competition. The RLM ordered that both be tested in the HE-280. First powered flight, April 2, 1941. Demonstration before the Luftwaffe and the RLM 3 days later. This time the reaction was different. This time formal work teams were created, engine facilities were expanded, and Heinkel merged his division with Helmuth Hirth's Hirth Company to speed up development. Müller and his team moved to the Hirth factory in Stuttgart. Von Ohain remained in Rostock-Marienje working on the next model, the 109-11, projected to give 1,300 kilos of thrust. The rivalry between the two teams was intense, and both progressed considerably. And then the RLM ordered, for reasons never fully explained, to stop work on the 109-6, although it already produced 900 kilos of thrust. The 109-11 continued in Stuttgart, but at the end of the war it had still not run more than on the test bench, with only 20 copies completed. 9 prototypes of the He-280 were built. When it faced the Me-262 directly, it lost out. There are indications that the decision to adopt the Me-262 had at least partially political motivations, given that relations between manufacturers, the RLM, and the Luftwaffe were, as an expert of the time described it, something similar to tribal warfare. The 9 prototypes of the He-280 were converted for tests of new wing and tail designs. Heinkel continued working on other jet projects, almost all dependent on the stagnant 109-11 engine, until he was selected for the Volksjäger project that produced the He-162. What the He-280 represented, however, was a specific date, April 2, 1941. A twin-engine jet fighter with combat capability flew 2 years and 7 months before the Me-262 entered operational service. The technology was not missing. The institutional will to take it seriously was missing. On September 8, 1944, the RLM distributed an urgent specification to all major German manufacturers. The requirement? A light fighter, cheap, with simple piloting, with less than 2,000 kilos of weight at takeoff, BMW 3-engine, 30 minutes of autonomy and armament of 230mm cannons. It was to be piloted by Hitler Jugend volunteers. It should fly before the end of the year. Messerschmitt declined the invitation. Heinkel's design was chosen, placing the engine in a gondola on top of the fuselage with the exhaust gases between 2 twin fins. By September 23rd, a mock-up was built. On December 6, 1944, 3 weeks before the deadline, the prototype flew for the first time. On December 10th, it crashed during a high-speed low pass. Test pilot Flugkapitän Peters died when the starboard wing disintegrated. The investigation revealed that the failure was in the formulation of the phenolic resin used to bond the plywood of the planes. The hands were clumsy, but worked fast. By the end of January 1945, stability problems had been resolved for an experienced pilot, although it remained very treacherous for novices. They replaced the Mk 108 30mm cannon with the Mg 151 20mm. The wings were manufactured in furniture workshops. The Duralumin fuselage was produced in Junkers and Heinkel factories. Final assembly took place in Rostock-Marienähe, in Bernburg, and in the immense underground factory of Mittelwerke near Nordhausen. 275 He-162 were completed. There were components for 800 more at the end of the war. On May 4, 1945, Lieutenant Rudolf Schmidt of 1/JG-1, based in Leek near the Danish border, shot down an RAF Typhoon with his He-162. The credit was given to a nearby anti-aircraft gun battery. It was one of the last aerial combats of the Second World War. The post-war Allied evaluation was unequivocal. With a bit more development, the He-162 would have been entirely viable and would have caused a considerable impact if it had been available 12 months or 6 months earlier. The Comet was not a normal plane. It was 5.69 meters long and 9.33 meters wide. It lacked a conventional landing gear. It took off from a dolly that it left on the runway and landed on skids under the fuselage, which made every landing a gamble. Alexander Lippisch was a self-taught aerodynamicist who had worked at Zeppelin and Dornier after the First World War, then at the RRG, the Rhön-Rossitten-Gesellschaft, which developed gliders for meteorological research, and finally at the DFS, the German Institute for Glider Flight Research. Lippisch had been the first to fly a tailless delta-wing design in 1931. 3 years earlier, he had built for car manufacturer Fritz von Opel the Enter Duck, the first rocket-propelled plane that flew, piloted by Fritz Stammer on June 11, 1928. Opel lost interest in the early 30s after several pilots died in the jet gliders. The RLM temporarily banned tailless planes after 2 fatal accidents within 2 weeks, with the Delta III and Delta IV designs, built in collaboration with Gerhard Fieseler. Only pressure from Professor Walter Georgi, director of the DFS, lifted the ban. In 1939, Lippisch was transferred with his entire team to the Messerschmitt Research Center in Augsburg. The DFS 194, his delta-wing design with a small Walter Armo I-203 engine, became the Me 163 Comet. The engine used T-Stoff 80% aqueous solution of hydrogen peroxide with oxyquinoline as stabilizer and Z-Stoff aqueous solution of sodium and potassium permanganate as catalyst. The 2 propellants were so volatile that during the test program in Peenemünde West in the summer of 1941, accidents literally demolished entire buildings. It was not a metaphor. Spontaneous explosions in fuel handling destroyed facilities with some regularity. Glide tests in the spring of 1941 showed that the apparatus, towed up to 8,000 meters, reached 850 kilometers per hour in a dive while maintaining a high degree of controllability. In the summer, it was sent to Peenemünde West to receive its engine, an improved version of the Walter RY with some degree of thrust control but still using T-Stoff and Z-Stoff. Pilot Heini Dittmar broke the world speed record several times in a row. Finally, he exceeded 1,000 kilometers per hour, almost killing himself in the process. At that speed, the airflow over the wing surface locally exceeded the speed of sound, producing compression, negative lift, and massive vibrations that made the apparatus uncontrollable for several terrifying seconds. Dittmar survived and landed. The RLM, impressed, ordered operational prototypes. The Me 163B1 initially carried a pair of MG 151 20mm cannons, later replaced by the Mk 108 30mm in the wing roots, and some degree of armor protection for the pilot. The 509A2 engine produced 1,500 kilos of thrust using the T-Stoff and C-Stoff combination, a mixture of 30% hydrazine hydrate, 57% methanol, and 13% water, somewhat less unpredictable than the previous one, although never truly benign. A slip in handling C-Stoff during refueling could dissolve organic tissues. Ground accidents killed as many men as flight accidents. Little more than 2 tons of propellant, almost half of the total weight of the apparatus at takeoff of 4,110 kilos, were enough to take it to its operational ceiling of 12,100 meters in 3 minutes and 35 seconds. The pilot then had 4.5 more minutes of powered flight. The rest of the time it glided, and it glided at speeds that were still higher than those of any Allied fighter in that altitude range. The problem with this combat profile was mathematical. The Comet approached a formation of B-17 bombers at speeds of almost 900 kilometers per hour. The fastest Allied bomber flew at about 460 kilometers per hour. The difference in speeds at the moment of attack was greater than 400 kilometers per hour. The effective fire time before the target disappeared from the sight was approximately 2 seconds. The Mk 108 cannons had a rate of fire of about 600 rounds per minute, which meant that in 2 seconds, 20 projectiles could be fired enough if they hit the right place, insufficient if the aim was imperfect by a centimeter. Most pilots passed like meteors through the formations before adjusting the shot. 2 Me 163 B1A were delivered to a special Luftwaffe unit in early 1943 to begin pilot familiarization, although training did not really begin until July. The high landing speed of the Comet, around 220 kilometers per hour, combined with the fact that the pilot was committed from the start, with no power available to gain height on a second attempt, caused many accidents, most of them fatal. A pilot who flew over the runway too high had no engine with which to correct. He had only one attempt. The first operational unit began to form in Wittmundhaven in May 1944. On August 16, 1944, 1/JG-400 entered combat for the first time. Lieutenant Hartmut Rill shot down a B-17 near Leipzig a few days later. Victories accumulated in modest numbers during the following months, with the Comet defending in particular the Leuna Merseburg refinery complex, a frequent target of Allied aviation. Allied bombers had learned to fly in formation to maximize their cross-defensive fire. The Comet arrived so fast that often the B-17 gunners did not even manage to aim. About 300 Me-163 were built in various versions. Manufacturing rights were sold to Japan, where 5 powered versions designated Mitsubishi J8 M1 Shusui were built, and more than 50 engineless training versions, although none reached combat before the end of the war. The total victories credited to the Comet does not exceed 12. There was an improved version in development, known initially as Ju-248, later adopted by Messerschmitt as Me-263. It was slightly larger, had landing gear with wheels instead of skids, and used the Walter 509C engine. It only reached prototype status. Erich Bachern was a glider pilot and former technical director of Fiesler AG, where he had designed, among other things, the Phi 156 Storch, the observation and liaison aircraft that the Wehrmacht used on all fronts. From that same company, Fiesler had manufactured wings for Henschel missiles and control surfaces for the A4. Bachern knew well the limit of what could be built fast and with accessible materials. He looked at the Comet with genuine technical skepticism. For him, the Me-163 was too complicated, too expensive, too dependent on scarce strategic materials and highly trained pilots. His proposal was something else, a wooden glider, extreme in simplicity, that could be built in any carpentry workshop. No aluminum, no special steel structures. Wood. The same material used to make the wings of the He-162 in furniture factories. The Bar 349 Natter Adder was 6.10 meters long and 3.60 meters wide. Launch weight, 2,200 kilos. 4. Schmidding 109-533 solid boosters would accelerate it from the ground, added to the Walter 109-509-2 main engine, the same engine as the Comet, with 1,700 kilos of thrust. The ensemble would take it to 14,000 meters in little more than a minute under an automatic guidance system. And the pilot was expected, with some optimism, would regain consciousness at altitude after having fainted during the violent takeoff start, would take command and launch his 24 Henschel H's 217 Föhn unguided rockets of 7.3 centimeters, or the R4M variant of 5.5 centimeters, from the array installed in the nose of the apparatus against the bomber formation. Then he would exit by parachute. The apparatus from the cockpit back would also descend by parachute, with the hope of recovering the Walter engine for reuse. It was simplicity taken to the extreme. The entire cell, including the fuselage, was built of wood. An air force with enough volunteers, enough Walter engines, and enough wood could in theory produce Natters in industrial quantities from any workshop in the Reich. Since December 22, 1944, a series of 11 unmanned launches was performed using only the solid fuel boosters. On February 23, 1945, a complete unmanned launch also used the Walter engine. Satisfactory results. The rate of unmanned tests had not been completed, and the engineers had serious doubts about the operational viability of the system, particularly about the ejection procedure, which no one had successfully tested. But the SS, who by then controlled all the Reich's secret weapons projects, ordered a manned launch. The chosen pilot was Lothar Siebert. There is no detailed record of what went wrong exactly. The BA-349 went into a dive from 1,500 meters after turning onto its back. Seibert died. The subsequent investigation identified with some probability that the cockpit canopy had not been properly secured and hit the pilot during the start, incapacitating him from the beginning. Tests continued. Perhaps 20 apparatuses, some sources say 36, were produced with operational intent. None flew in combat. It is believed that 2 examples survived the end of the war. One was taken to the United States and is kept in museum storage. Another remained in Germany. Ernst Heinkel proposed a similar design almost simultaneously, the P-1077 Julia, which never received an official RLM designation. Also powered by a Walter 509 engine and 4 Schmidding 533 solid boosters, the Julia would take off from an inclined ramp instead of vertically, climb to 15,000 meters in 72 seconds, and beyond with 2 Mk-108 cannons. It was a high-wing monoplane with almost square planform planes and a considerable anhedral at the tips. The drawings show 2 different tail configurations. There is no record of how the pilot was supposed to complete the mission and return to the ground safe and sound, very likely because no one had calculated it in a convincing way. The Natter, the Julia, and the other similar projects, the Zeppelin Rammer, which did not even reach prototype status, the Me 328 of DFS with its Argus Pulse engine, the BV-40 of Blohm and Voss, a pure engineless glider armed with 30mm cannons, were all, to a greater or lesser degree, expressions of the same desperation. The equation was simple and brutal. Germany could not continue losing highly trained pilots in sophisticated planes to shoot down bombers. It needed something cheap, simple, mass-producible, something that would put a man in front of a B-17 even if that man had known how to fly for 3 weeks. Nothing worked. Time didn't either. The first 10 V-1s were launched against England in the early morning of June 13, 1944. 4 crashed immediately, 2 fell into the sea, 4 reached English territory. It was not a glorious start. 2 days later, Operation Rumpelkammer began in earnest. Between 22 hours on June 15th and noon on the 16th, 244 V-1s were launched, most against London and some against Southampton. More than half crossed the English coast. In the following months, Colonel Max Wachtel's Anti-Aircraft Gun Regiment 155W would launch 9,017 missiles, of which 6,725 reached England. The V-1 was a first-generation cruise missile, a flying bomb. Its engine was an Argus 109-14 pulse jet that cycled 47 times per second, producing that unmistakable sound, the buzz that Londoners learned to fear. Paul Schmidt had begun experimenting with pulse engines in 1928. Dr. Fritz Goslau of Argus Motorengesellschaft developed the operational version. Robert Lusser, the same engineer who had worked on Project P1065 at Messerschmitt, designed the cell. Siemens produced the guidance system. The weapon measured about 8 meters long, wingspan of approximately 5 meters. Launch weight, 2,180 kilos. The warhead contained 830 kilos of trialenamytol. Maximum speed, 645 kilometers per hour. Autonomous range, 240 kilometers. The guidance system used a gyroscope for heading corrections and an aneroid barometer to maintain altitude. An odometer driven by a small propeller in the nose cone measured the distance traveled. When it reached the programmed figure, detonators blocked the rudder and ailerons, and 2 air brakes forced the final dive. The launch system was a 42-meter-long steam catapult with the steam mechanism generated by the reaction of T-Stoff and Z-Stoff. The missile was accelerated to about 400 kilometers per hour in less than half a second before its engine took autonomous control. The V-1 cost around 5,000 Reichsmarks in mass production, less than a tenth of the price of a Peaska PFW-4 battle tank. It was cheap, easy to manufacture. There were no pilots to lose. The Fiesler, Volkswagen factories, and especially the Mittelwerke underground plant in Nordhausen, produced the V-1s with slave labor from nearby concentration camps. about 34,000 copies in total. The Allies learned to shoot them down. The RAF's Gloucester Meteor made its combat debut on August 4, 1944, tipping a V-1 with its wingtip to destabilize it, a method preferred to direct shooting which could damage the own plane. The anti-aircraft batteries on the coasts ended up being more effective than the fighters, precisely because the V-1s flew in a straight line at constant altitude and at a fixed speed. But there was a piloted version, the Reichenberg project. 4 versions of the modified Phi-103. The operational R4 carried the reinstalled warhead and functional ailerons, without landing aids. The test pilots were Heinz Kenscher and Hanna Reich, who reported favorably on the flight, although with spine-chilling moments, but with little enthusiasm about the landing. The arrangement was euphemistically cynical. The cockpit was very far back, under the engine air intake, and opening the canopy in a dive at more than 1,000 kilometers per hour before ejecting was practically impossible. Thousands of people volunteered for the Selbstopfermänner program. 70 were selected for training. They were never ordered into action. On September 5, 1944, Artillery Battery 444 launched the first operational V-2 against Paris. 3 days later, Battery 485 fired 2 rockets aiming at London. The first fell on Staveley Road, Chiswick in West London, although the target was Southwark, 13 kilometres further east at 18:45 hours, collapsing 6 houses, killing 3 people and injuring 17. The sound arrived after the impact. The missile travelled at 2,900 kilometers per hour when touching ground, well above the speed of sound. There was no possible defence. The history of the V-2, called A4 by its creators, began in a test field of the Heeresversuchsanstalt, 32 kilometers south of Berlin, in Kummersdorf. Captain Walter Dornberger was appointed responsible for the project in 1930. That same year, a promising engineering student named Werner von Braun joined Hermann Oberth's Society for Space Travel. In 1932, with a BSc in mechanical engineering from the Technical Institute of Berlin, von Braun began working at Kummersdorf. By December 1934, his group had launched 2 A2 rockets powered by liquid oxygen and ethyl alcohol that reached more than 2,500 meters. The program moved to Peenemünde, a remote peninsula on the island of Usedom, on the Baltic coast in 1936. Dornberger was named chief of the Weapons Testing Section 11. Von Braun was its technical director. The third launch attempt of the A4 prototype on October 3, 1942, was finally successful. The missile flew more than 200 kilometers, reached an altitude of 85 kilometers, the ionosphere, at the edge of space, and fell within 4 kilometers of its target. Dornberger summoned his team and pronounced some words that sounded strange in wartime. "Today we invented the space rocket." Hitler approved the program on December 22, 1942. On August 17, 1943, the RAF sent 596 mixed aircraft over Peenemünde. 1,828 tons of bombs fell. Around 800 people died, including Dr. Walter Thiel, the man responsible for the engine. The program suffered a delay of perhaps 2 months. The first deliveries arrived in July 1944. From September, a stable production of more than 600 missiles per month was maintained, assembled in the Mittelwerke underground factory with components manufactured throughout occupied Europe. The A4 in its final form measured slightly more than 14 meters. Diameter, 1.68 meters. Takeoff weight, 12,870 kilos. The warhead, 975 kilos of amatol mixture. The propellant, 4,900 kilos of liquid oxygen and 3,770 kilos of methanol comprised most of the interior volume. The steam turbine that pumped the propellants into the combustion chamber produced about 675 horsepower at 5,000 revolutions per minute. The engine generated 25,000 kilos of thrust during 70 seconds of powered flight. Maximum speed, 5,580 kilometers per hour. Maximum range, 330 kilometers. Total flight time, 3 minutes and 40 seconds. 5 batteries based near The Hague fired towards Paris, London, Brussels, Antwerp, Liège, Luxembourg, and the Rhine crossing at Remagen. The northern group fired 1,120 missiles against England. 1,054 impacted on English soil, 517 in Greater London. The official figures: 2,754 dead and 6,532 injured. In the 200 days of the campaign against London from September 8, 1944 to March 27, 1945, the last missile fell on a block of apartments in Whitechapel, killing 134 people. There was a project to launch V-2s from submarines, a container designed to float vertically, towed by a U-boot. Tests reached advanced stages at the Vulcan shipyard in Stettin. The target was New York. It was determined that a fully loaded missile would not survive the transatlantic voyage even if submerged. The project remained archived. Estimates of total production range between 6,000 and 10,000 units. The most cited figure is close to 6,000. The Type 21 was not the most dangerous submarine of the Second World War because of what it did. It was the most dangerous because of what it represented: the first immersion vessel in history that was faster submerged than on the surface. It measured 76.7 meters in length and 6.6 meters in beam. It displaced 1,620 tons on the surface. It had 2 MAN diesel engines of 1,000 horsepower each, driven to 2 shafts by 2 electric motors of 1,250 horsepower, or by 2 low-speed motors of 57 horsepower. On the surface, 15.5 knots, submerged with main engines, more than 17 knots, with auxiliary motors, 5 knots in almost absolute silence. A conventional German submarine of the time reached no more than 7 or 8 knots on battery in short bursts while submerged, and then was exhausted. The Type 21 could maintain 17 knots for hours. Allied destroyers designed to hunt submarines by dropping depth charges from their stern had an equivalent pursuit speed. A Type 21 at full submerged speed simply pulled away. The story of how it came to exist is almost anecdotal. In a meeting where Professor Helmuth Walter presented his 2-deck submarine design with the lower space dedicated to hydrogen peroxide fuel for his revolutionary engine, someone pointed out that it would be just as easy to fill that lower space with batteries. The observation was in passing. It changed the design of all the world's submarines for decades. The Type 21 carried 6 torpedo tubes in the bow with a total of 23 torpedoes, not the 4 reload ones originally planned. They were built with modular and prefabricated technique, hull modules produced in several plants and assembled in the shipyards of Blohm and Voss in Hamburg, Deschimag in Bremen and Schichau in Danzig. Almost 700 units were scheduled. Only 121 were commissioned. Many more were bombed in the shipyards before launching. A substantial number remained incomplete at the end of the war. Some were transferred to the Soviet Union, so eager was it for German submarines that it went so far as to load incomplete hull sections onto the deck of the unfinished aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin and attempted to tow it through the Baltic to Leningrad, hitting a mine in the Gulf of Finland and sinking it. Only 2 Type 21 conducted operational patrols. Neither fired a single torpedo in combat. The impact of what they represented cannot be underestimated. They changed the global perception of what a submarine could do. All post-war designs, up to modern teardrop shapes, reflect them. The Soviets used them as the basis for their submarine construction program for years. They had arrived too late for the war in the Atlantic. They were perfect for the next one. They arrived in combat in April 1944. The first of them was found by a British ship floating in the Mediterranean Sea, a hunched figure visible through the small fogged plexiglass dome, motionless. Upon boarding the strange artifact, the sailors separated the canopy from the torpedo-shaped hull and extracted the lifeless body of the pilot, dead in his small cold coffin. He was the first pilot of the Kleinkampfverbände to fall into enemy hands. The Neger was designed at a meeting on December 21, 1943 at the TVA Torpedoversuchsanstalt, the Torpedo Research Department in Eckernförde. Naval Construction Councillor Richard Moore set out his idea before the commander of the TVA, Konteradmiral Rudolf Juncker. The theory was simple: a standard G7E electric torpedo with the warhead removed and rudimentary controls installed in a compartment barely sufficient for a single pilot. Another active torpedo hung below to be fired upon reaching the target. The name Neger was a play on words with its inventor's surname. Moore means Moor in German. On January 18, 1944, Hitler approved the construction of 50 midget submarines and Moore's one-man torpedo. Dönitz summarized it without embellishment: "We need 4 years to complete a battleship, but only 4 days to prepare 10 one-man torpedoes." Testing began at the TVA in Eckernförde under the supervision of Moore and the Chief of Staff of the K-Verbände, Fritz Frauenheim. Oberleutnant zur See Johann Otto Krieg, former commander of U-81, the submarine that had sunk HMS Ark Royal in 1941, was recruited by Dönitz to carry out the first tests, despite the existing ban on U-boot commanders joining the K-Verbände. U-81 had been sunk by Allied bombing in Pola on January 4, 1944, leaving Krieg free. On the eve of his planned wedding, he was summoned to Berlin by the Gross Admiral and received direct orders to immediately begin tests. With him joined the inseparable Fähnrich Petke and Potthast, the duo of the two Ps within the K-Verbände. The three became the nucleus of the weapon's first trial. Krieg carried out the first tests in the Baltic without any protective dome, with only a rubberized canvas anti-spray skirt protecting his shoulders. It was almost impossible. A plexiglass dome taken from the nose of the gunner's post of Dornier planes at the Friedrichshafen factory was quickly installed. Along the lower part of the dome there were graduated marks that the pilot aligned with a short rod welded to the nose of the torpedo to use as a sight. Rudimentary, sufficient for a static target in calm conditions. A target in evasive maneuver was another story. The plexiglass introduced another problem: the pilot's air supply. Tests with the three pioneers showed that the air available inside the torpedo was enough for 7 hours at 4 knots before the pilot risked asphyxiation. It was practicable. It was also potentially lethal in operational circumstances. The solution came from the aeronautical sector: potash cartridges and breathing equipment taken from Luftwaffe fighter pilots. Battery space had to be sacrificed to install them. It was the necessary compromise. The first group of 40 volunteer pilots recruited from all branches of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS began instruction in Eckernförde, a K-Verbände base named Blaukoppel. Under the direction of Kapitänleutnant Michael Opladen, coming from the Abwehr, the men received commando-style training in Heiligenhafen and then basic navigation and torpedo firing technique under Krieg. The training was not without cost. At least one man died when the active torpedo did not detach from the carrier during a practical exercise against a moored ship. Unable to open the dome from inside, the pilot remained trapped while his craft crashed into the hull of the ship. On April 2021, 1944, Krieg launched the first combat operation of the K-Verbände, 37 Negers against the Allied support fleet off Anzio Nettuno. The launch from Torvajanica Beach was an operational chaos. 14 Negers remained stranded in the sand before reaching the sea. Their wheels sunk in the glutinous terrain and were destroyed at dawn. The 500 Fallschirmjäger, borrowed from a nearby paratrooper division to carry the torpedoes from ground to water, could barely move the 5-ton apparatuses. 23 Negers reached the sea. The Allies already knew that something was being prepared. Decipherments of the naval enigma. The Dolphin Code, since December 1943, had revealed that the Germans had recovered the X-craft lost in the attack on the Tirpitz and developed small combat units of their own. A special alert named Wide Awake was ordered the same day of the attack. However, 10 Negers reached their target areas. The results were modest. The Allies did not confirm any definitive impact attributable to the Neger. One was found circling slowly with the pilot dead of asphyxiation, the engine still active. Captured intact, It revealed the complete design of the weapon to Allied intelligence. The Marder was the next evolution. It could submerge completely to attack. The Molch Salamander was slightly more sophisticated, with recirculating air supply, and carried 2 torpedoes hung under the hull. About 400 were built and used with some success in the Scheldt estuary in 1944 and 1945. The Biber arose from a capture. In Operation Barbara of November 21, 1943, the Norwegian midget submarine W-46, a British whaleman from the 30th MTB flotilla of the Royal Norwegian Navy, was caught in a net off Bergen and forced to the surface, where a German patrol captured it. The pilot was imprisoned. The whaleman was studied. The Biber Beaver was the result. First, authentic German mini-submarine with a diesel engine for the surface and battery for immersion. It displaced 3.4 tons. It carried 2 torpedoes hung under the hull. The prototype, named Adam by its creators, was launched at the Flender shipyard in Lübeck, where it immediately sank next to the pier. Engineers recovered it and continued. Hans Bartels, in command of Lehrkommando 250, supervised the training of the pilots at the base named Blaukoppel in Lübeck. More than 300 Bibers were built. They could be transported by road, by air, or by specially modified conventional submarines. They operated in the Scheldt estuary and off Murmansk, in the convoy concentration zone. The best of all was the Seehund Seal. 2 crew members, 15.2 tons of displacement. The commander of the Seehund unit, in Lehrkommando 300, was initially the veteran Hermann Rasch, former commander of the successful U-106, replaced in February 1945 by Fregattenkapitän Albrecht Brandy, one of the 2 most decorated members of the entire Kriegsmarine. Disposable auxiliary fuel tanks gave the Seehund a range of about 800 kilometers. Speed: 8 knots on the surface, 6 knots submerged. The Seehunds operated with relative success in the mouth of the Scheldt. German sources, not all confirmed, claim that they also attacked merchant ships in the Thames estuary and off Margate. The K-Verbände as a whole produced a unique collection of young men who operated in conditions that would test any veteran. Lawrence Patterson himself, in his research on the organization, recalled that in a meeting of the Seehund Pilots Association in Munich in December 2004, one of the former pilots, now an old man, spoke with visible emotion before his comrades about the decades-long struggle for the association to be officially recognized within the U-Boot Veterans Organization. The men of the K-Verbände deserved, according to Patterson, greater recognition for their service. Courage is not necessarily measured by success. On September 9, 1943, 12 Dornier Do 217 K2 from the 3rd Gruppe of Kampfgeschwader 100 under the command of Major Bernhard Joop took off from Istres near Marseille and headed south. The Italian fleet had just left port heading for Malta. Rome had not yet formally decided which side the Italian Navy was on. The Do 217 climbed and spotted 3 battleships. Joop ordered the attack. The X-1 bombs were not normal bombs. They were the most precise guided weapon the world had seen. They were based on the standard German PC-1400 bomb, a 1,400-kilo armor-piercing bomb, modified with 4 large asymmetrical fins in front of the midpoint and a 12-sided frame on the tail. Inside, spoilers, small tabs actuated by electromagnets and controlled by radio from the plane that launched them. An observer in the plane followed the flares or lamps installed on the tail of the bomb and corrected its trajectory with a lever. It was not exactly a glider. Its forward speed was what the launching plane had given it. Control could only modify its trajectory to a small extent. But that small measure was the difference between hitting and missing. On September 9th, the X-1 hit the Italian battleship Roma. 2 impacts. The Roma split in 2 and sank. Admiral Carlo Bergamini died with almost all his crew. A second battleship, the Italia, was damaged. The USS Savannah was hit on September 11th. The HMS Warspite was damaged on September 16th. The HMS Spartan was sunk in January 1944. 1,386 X-1s were produced between April 1943 and December 1944, a figure much lower than the planned 750 per month. Only 602 were used in operations, training and tests. The reason for the limited production was complex. The RLM was slow to prioritize the weapon. The crews who would handle it needed specialized training. And the Allies learned fast, forcing the carrier planes to descend below 4,000 meters to ensure visual control put them within reach of the defense. The maximum performance of the X-1 was at heights of more than 6,000 meters. The X-1 was a first-rate weapon in expert hands. It arrived at the battlefield too late and in numbers too small to change the balance in the Mediterranean. The H's 293 was different from the Fritz X in one fundamental aspect. It had its own rocket engine, a liquid fuel schmidding that produced 610 kilos of thrust for 11 seconds. The missile accelerated. The observer of the launching plane controlled it via radio the Kael/Strasbourg system and directed it against the target, seeing the flares on its tail. It was a high-explosive missile intended for escort and transport ships, not for armored battleships. The weapon was developed by the engineer Herbert Wagner of Henschel, who joined the team in January 1940 with instructions from the RLM to concentrate on air-to-surface missiles. The first actions of the HS-293 occurred in August 1943, when two Gruppe/KG-100, equipped with Heinkel HE-177, used it against Allied ships in the Bay of Biscay. On August 25, the destroyer HMS Egret was sunk, the first confirmed victim of a guided missile in the history of naval warfare. Convoy OG-92 suffered several more losses in following days. The USS Philadelphia was hit in September. The HMS Uganda suffered heavy damage in October. The Allies responded by developing radio jamming countermeasures. When the Germans changed frequencies, the Allies jammed again. The radio-guided jamming race became a game of cat and mouse in which the Germans had the technical advantage, but the Allies had more resources. A version of the HS-293 for an air-to-air role was proposed as the HS-293H, with a 295-kilo warhead to be detonated inside bomber formations. A variant with a television camera in the nose that would transmit the image to the controller of the launching plane was tested, but turned out to be too unreliable. Henschel also developed the HS-294, a guided aerial torpedo designed to hit the water and continue under the surface towards the ship's hull. All these variants were still in development or limited production when the war ended. The problem with radio-guided missiles was simple. Signals could be jammed. The Allies had proven it. The German solution was the wire. The X-4, developed by Ruhrstahl AG in collaboration with Dr. Max Kramer of the DVL German Aviation Research Institute since 1943, was an air-to-air missile guided by two wires 5.5 kilometers long that unwound from spools at the ends of two of its fins. The control signal traveled through those wires, polarity for pitch control, intensity variations for yaw control. The missile rotated slowly in flight around 1 revolution per second, induced by trim tabs on the main fins. A gyroscope transferring control signals between the rear fin's spoilers compensated for this rotation, so the operator simply moved the joystick without thinking about the spin. The control wires twisted as the missile rotated, but that did not matter. It would make at most 24 revolutions during the full flight. The X-4 had main wings swept back at a sharp angle with chord parallel approximately halfway from the nose and 4 smaller fins behind, turned 45 degrees relative to the main ones with movable spoilers for control. Propulsion: the BMW 109-548 liquid fuel engine. Although in many test launches, the Schmidding 109-603 solid fuel engine was used. Warhead: 20 kilos of explosive with proximity or command fuse. The first test fire from an airplane, an FW-190, was performed on August 11, 1944. By that date, 224 prototypes had already been produced. In total, about 1,000 frames were produced between August and December 1944 for operational use. But production of the BMW 109-548 engine was destroyed in a bombing of the factory. The engines that had already been manufactured perished too. The X-4 never entered operational service. It was the most sophisticated air-to-air missile produced during the Second World War. It would have been devastating against compact Allied bomber formations. It never came to be fired in combat. EMW Elektromechanische Werke, code name for the military facility at Peenemünde, was commissioned to create an anti-aircraft missile. It made sense to entrust it to them. They had already solved all the basic problems with the V2. The Wasserfall waterfall was essentially a V2 scaled down. It measured 7.84 meters. It weighed 3,500 kilos at takeoff compared to 12,900 for the V2. But the critical design difference was not the size. It was the propellant. An anti-aircraft missile had to be on constant alert, perhaps for months, ready to launch in seconds. The V2 used liquid oxygen at -183 degrees Celsius. Maintaining that on a launch pad for hours was impracticable. The Wasserfall used instead salbei, 90% nitric acid, 10% sulfuric acid to inhibit corrosion, and a type of Visol that ignited spontaneously upon mixing the two components. The system was storable at room temperature. The engine produced 8,000 kilos of thrust for 40 seconds. That gave the Wasserfall a range of up to 50 kilometers and an operational altitude of 20,000 meters, well above the ceiling of any bomber of the time. The guidance system was manual and ground-based, with heading corrections transmitted by radio from the ground. The first successful launch occurred on February 29, 1944 in Peenemünde. About 35 test launches were performed in total. Series production was to be carried out in Bleichrode, the largest underground factory of all, but not even that factory had been built when the war ended. The reason for the failure was familiar. The same team working on the V2 had to work on the Wasserfall, and Hitler gave absolute priority to the offensive program. The Wasserfall reached the threshold of production and stayed there. BMW engineers even proposed directly cancelling it and concentrating on a simpler anti-aircraft rocket without guidance. The designer of the proposal was the ranking officer at Peenemünde, an engineer named Schufein, whose Typhoon was ordered for development in September 1944. The Typhoon was 1.93 meters long and 100 millimeters in diameter. It weighed 21 kilos at launch. It reached 15,000 meters at a maximum speed of 3,600 kilometers per hour. It cost 25 Reichsmarks, less than a third of the price of a rifle. It is estimated that 600 were produced in early 1945, along with a small number of launchers. There is no evidence that it shot down any plane, although it could have done so without anyone knowing. The Schmetterling Butterfly was the most elegant and best-designed anti-aircraft missile in the German arsenal. Developed by Henschel following the work of Herbert Wagner, it used the same Kehl/Strasbourg radio guidance system as the H's 293, but applied to an ascending trajectory against bombers at high altitude. The missile weighed 1,800 kilos, of which 300 were the warhead. It reached 24.5 kilometers in distance and several thousand meters in altitude. 2 solid booster rockets took it to operational speed. Then its own engine took control. The observer at the launch post followed the flare on the tail of the missile and guided it towards the bomber formation. A version, the H's 117H, was proposed for the air-to-air role, launched from an airplane without the booster rockets, with a larger warhead of 100 kilos of explosive. The designed range was 6 to 10 kilometers, up to 5,000 meters above the launching plane. The problem of the Schmetterling program was the same that afflicted all late German projects. In January 1945, Albert Speer ordered the cancellation of all development projects that could not enter production in a very short term. The Schmetterling was cancelled. Only the HS-117H survived because it shared enough technology with the anti-surface missile from which it descended to justify continuation. Neither of the two reached operational service. Ruhestahl was not satisfied with guided bombs and aerial missiles. The X-7 Rotkäppchen Little Red Riding Hood moved the same wire guidance technology to the anti-tank battle. The X-7 was an anti-armor missile of 300 kilos at launch, with a 2.5 kilo shaped charge warhead of explosive material designed to penetrate armor through the Monroe effect. A high-speed jet of molten metal. It was wire-guided like the aerial X-4 from the launch post to the target with a single fin system, a kind of curved hanging spur that, as the missile rotated, allowed controlling both pitch and yaw with the same actuator. 2 Weissag solid fuel engines. The first produced 68 kilos of thrust for 2.5 seconds to launch the missile and take it to its operational speed of 360 kilometers per hour. The second gave 5.5 kilos of thrust for 8 seconds to maintain it. Maximum range, about 1,200 meters. It is estimated that several hundred were manufactured, most consumed in tests. There is some evidence that some reached the Eastern Front in 1945 and were used in combat. Unconfirmed sources claim that the X-7 proved effective even against the JS-1 Stalin, practically invulnerable to any other weapon at more than short range. It was, in essence, the direct ancestor of the modern guided anti-tank missile. The wire guidance technology that made it possible would have been, deployed in time, a serious threat to Allied armor. The Schnorkel was not a German invention. The Netherlands had perfected it around 1936 and had operational submarines with it when the Germans invaded in May 1940. The occupiers examined the captured apparatuses and ignored them. The Kriegsmarine's policy was to stay on the surface as much as possible, submerging only to escape or for an especially risky attack. Until 1943, that worked more or less well. From that year on, Allied aerial anti-submarine patrols forced them to submerge constantly, and a submerged submarine running on battery could only advance slowly and for limited time before having to come up to recharge. The first German submarine equipped with a Schnorkel seems to have been U-264. It was sunk in February 1944 during its first attempt to use the tube. First-generation Schnorkels created their own problems. If the head valve remained underwater, the diesels began to suck the air from inside the submarine, creating a severe negative overpressure before stopping. But they worked. They allowed the submarine to navigate submerged with the diesel engines active. The crew could no longer go out on deck in brief shifts. It was unpopular. It was also the key to tactical survival. The Type 23 combined the Schnorkel with massive batteries to create the coastal electro-submarine. 34.7 meters in length, 233 tons on the surface, only 14 crew members, 2 torpedo tubes in the bow, no reloads. Submerged speed, 22 knots on main motor, 5 knots with low-speed motor in almost complete silence. With the auxiliary motor, it could remain submerged, doing 4 knots for 40 hours. The U-2321 was launched in Hamburg on April 17, 1944. 63 units were completed before the end of the war. Only 10 operational patrols were carried out between March and May 1945. 6 merchant ships were sunk. 2 of them by U-2336 off the coast of Scotland on May 7, 1945, among the last sinkings of the war. The Allies had neutralized the first-generation acoustic homing of German torpedoes with a simple measure, the Foxer, a device towed astern that made noise to distract acoustic guidance torpedoes, originally no more than 2 iron pipes chained together that clashed continuously. It was rudimentary, it worked. German engineers perfected their response in September 1943. The T-5 Zaunkönig Wren used a passive acoustic seeker that, upon detecting a sound source in a small arc in front of it, activated a solenoid that turned the torpedo sharply to starboard. The torpedo then described a semicircle in the necessary time, then turned sharply to starboard again and resumed its original trajectory. This circular movement took it around the towed Foxer to the noise of the propellers of the ship itself that was further ahead in the direction of the torpedo. Upon detecting that noise in front of it, the torpedo again described the circular arc. The geometry of the system guaranteed impact from the side. It is estimated that 700 T-5s were fired in combat. 77 reached their target, an impact rate of 11%. The US Navy introduced its analog, the Mark 27, in 1944. With 106 combat launches, the Mark 27 achieved 33 impacts, a 31%. The difference in effectiveness reflected the level of technical refinement of each system. In 1942, Hitler visited the Krupp facilities in Essen. Gustav Krupp told him about the 80-centimeter gun project. Hitler, with his known fascination for the massive, ordered 3 to be built. The Gustav gun was the first piece completed. It was named in honor of the company's chairman. Gustav weighed 1,350,000 kilos, including its railway carriage. The gun itself had a caliber of 80 centimeters. The gun fired projectiles of 2 types. The concrete piercer of 7,100 kilos, the heaviest artillery projectile ever fired in combat, to a range of 38 kilometers. The high explosive one of 4,800 kilos to 47 kilometers. The gun required a crew of approximately 2,000 men and 3 weeks to assemble or disassemble. It needed double railway tracks for the entire length of its journey. In 1942, Gustav was transported to Crimea for the siege of Sevastopol. It fired 48 projectiles in total, including one that destroyed an underground ammunition magazine. It played a role in the fall of the city. Then it was returned to Essen to reline the barrel. Dora took its place, although it is doubtful that it ever fired. At the end of the war, parts of Dora were found near Leipzig, parts of Gustav in Bavaria, components of the third gun that was never completed in Essen. The cost of each piece was 7 million Reichsmarks, without counting the special train or the personnel. The results were, as a subsequent analysis qualified it, an extremely expensive exercise in futility. The same conclusion reached by those responsible at the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Armament Ministry, who from the beginning had protested that they had no viable tactical plan for the use of such monsters and had been ignored by the Führer. Brothers Walter and Reimar Horten had been building delta wing gliders since the early 30s. The relationship between Walter and Ernst Udet, the Luftwaffe's head of procurement, had given them access to official evaluations almost from the beginning. Hanna Reitsch, the most prominent test pilot of Nazi Germany, had evaluated their designs and reported favorably on their flight characteristics. In 1940, the Hortens operated a Luftwaffe design studio known as Sonderkommando 9 in Göttingen. In it, they produced the plans for the Ho 9, a jet-powered flying wing fighter with 2 UMO 4B turbines. The first prototype was completed as a glider. The second, powered, was destroyed in a forced landing with a single engine, but not before reaching speeds greater than 800 kilometers per hour. To enter production, the design was transferred to the Gotha Wagon Fabric workshops as the Go 229. Gotha engineers had serious reservations about the straight-line stability of the apparatus' tendency to Dutch roll, yawing around the vertical axis while oscillating laterally. They planned to stop construction after the 6th prototype. The Hortens agreed and developed a variant with a pronounced V-keel. Only one prototype, with the more powerful Jumo 4C engine, was completed before the end of the war. 4 more were under construction. Projected calculations gave the Go 229 a maximum speed in level flight of over 1,000 kilometers per hour, the fastest production aircraft of its time by a wide margin. But the matter did not end there. In February 1945, when the RLM resurrected the America Bomber program bomber capable of reaching targets in the United States and returning the Hortens, presented an enlarged version of the Ho 9, which they called P-18. It was selected for production. Reimar Horten went directly to Hermann Göring with a modified version, the P-18B, with 4 HES-11 engines. With that configuration, he predicted with confidence that the plane would have a range of 11,000 kilometers at 850 kilometers per hour, would fly at 16,000 meters altitude, and would carry 4,000 kilos of bombs. Göring ordered him to build it. The war had 10 weeks of life. Detailed specifications were perhaps drawn up. In 1936, the German chemist Gerhard Schrader synthesized a new organophosphate compound working on insecticide research. He called it Tabun, ethyl dimethyl amidophosphor cyanidate. It was the first nerve agent in history. In 1938, sarin was synthesized, isopropyl methylphosphorofluoridate, even more powerful. In 1944, soman appeared, still more lethal. By 1942, a factory in Dyhern-Firth in Silesia, currently Brzeg Dolny, in Poland produced Tabun at a rate of 1,016 metric tons per month. At the end of the war, there were stored about 500,000 shells and 100,000 bombs loaded with nerve agents in German ammunition depots, which the Allies found and examined with growing horror. There was no known antidote. There was no cure. The Allied military doctors who examined the agents in the days following the German capitulation were terrified. The Allies knew nothing of the existence of these agents until the Red Army took Dyhern-Firth in early 1945. For Western researchers, the discovery came from captured ammunition depots. The first complete news reached Washington and London when there was no longer a war. Why Germany never used these agents is one of the most analyzed questions of the war. Historians agree on the essentials. The German High Command could not be sure that the Allies did not also have similar weapons. Mutually assured destruction as a strategic concept exists, in fact, before the atomic bomb. The SS, which by the end of the war controlled all secret weapons programs, evaluated tactical use but did not order it. Possibly because Hitler, despite having himself survived a mustard gas attack in the First World War, had a known ambivalence about the use of chemical agents in the open field. There is also another factor, the delivery carriers, the Heinkel. Her 177 Greif was modified in at least one example to carry the atomic bomb that was never completed, but systems for delivery of chemical agents in tactically relevant quantities would have required a concentration of aviation that Germany no longer had in 1944 to 1945. Tabun and sarin were the best-kept secret of the Third Reich, more secret than the Me 262, more secret than the V2, and, for reasons that historians still debate, the only secret that its creators decided to keep until the end. These 20 weapons represent more than a catalogue of war engineering. They are the map of a collapse. Each weapon on this list arrived too late, was produced in insufficient numbers, or was sabotaged by decisions of the own leadership that was supposed to deploy it. The Me 262 took 2 years to enter service after its first full jet flight, partly because of Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber. The Wasserfall, which would have been able to defend German airspace with unprecedented effectiveness, yielded resources to the offensive V2 because Hitler preferred attacks on London to the defense of Berlin. The Type 21 submarine reached the sea when the Atlantic no longer mattered. The nerve agents, which would have been able to instantly change the tactical equation on any front, remained in their warehouses. Werner von Braun designed the first intercontinental ballistic missile in history. The Horten brothers drew the precursor of the stealth flying wing. Flettner built the first operational naval helicopter. Ruhrstahl engineers invented the guided anti-tank missile. All this was conceived, built and tested between 1939 and 1945 under Allied bombings, with raw materials becoming scarce, with engineers working in underground factories lit by spotlights. The ingenuity existed. Time did not. The final question is not whether these weapons were capable of changing the outcome of the war. The question is whether any outcome would have justified what Germany represented. And history already has that answer.